Buenas noches. Good evening from Loíza, Puerto Rico. I'm Marta Moreno Vega, Director and Founder of Creative Justice Initiative. And those of you who have been following us, welcome again, because we have been conducting a series of conversations looking at the field of institutions grounded in their communities, culturally grounded in their communities. And most of us grew out of the civil rights movement, and that's how we started the first panel, looking at how we started these institutions and the movements that we initiated, like the Black Arts Movement, the Eureka Movement, women's movements, and we were movement-oriented and social justice-oriented in our creation. And now, for many institutions, 50 years plus, we're still in the trenches doing the work. And again, the issue, prompted by the movement for Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, brings up the issue in full view, global view, of how we have to still focus on social justice, our civil rights, and our right to have institutions that reflect our communities, our people, and our aesthetics, and preserve the legacy of those who came before us. So today we're going to discuss a very important topic, which is always the funding issue. How do our institutions survive? When I started, and just before we came on, we were talking about what it looked like when we, the elders, right, started these institutions in the 60s and 70s, where there was no one that looked like us in funding institutions. The only area that we had people that reflected us was at the National Endowment for the Arts, where we had Vanti Whitfield, A.B. Spellman, Yvonne Rory, and others who understood the work that we were doing. So now we have more people that understand the need for maintaining these institutions. So that I'd like to introduce you to the moderator, Olga Garay-English, who is a dear friend, and we worked together when she was in the Doris Duke Foundation, and she will introduce the panel. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Marta. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part of this discussion. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. I'd like them to say their name, their affiliation, title, and where they are based. And I want to also tell the participants who are listening in that if you have questions or if you have comments, please use the chat function. And at the end of the discussion, Marta will select some questions that will be introduced to the panelists. So for the first part of the discussion, we want to focus on the panelists. And then at the end of the discussion, we will have an opportunity to hear some of your comments and your questions. So I'm going to just start with the people that I see. No, I'm going to start alphabetically by first name. So Alvin, could you introduce yourself?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alvin Starks. I'm the director of the Equality Fund at the Open Society Foundations. I live in Brooklyn, New York, but I am from Virginia, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Then Billy.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Billy Ocasio. I'm the director of the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture. Before that, let me just tell you that I spent 20 years in government, 16 on Chicago City Council and 4 working for the governor. I'm now a recovered politician, totally into the arts. My wife and I spent 15 years creating the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture in Chicago. Thank you all for inviting us.
Thank you, Billy. Gonzalo.
Buenas noches. My name is Gonzalo Casals, and I'm the commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And it seems I did the opposite direction in career as Billy. For many years, I worked at El Museo del Barrio, and now, I'm working in the administration.
Perfect. Thank you. Leticia.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be here with colleagues in this conversation, which for me is close to my heart. I am the Vice President of Programs at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. We're based out of New York, but we're a national funder. We're actually an international funder. And I myself, right now, I'm in the Boogie Down Bronx in New York City.
Okay, Margaret.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Marta and Olga, for including me in this this amazing group of leaders. Both Olga and Marta have been real partners with me and at Ford Foundation and before me at the Ford Foundation. So it's wonderful to be part of this. I'm the Director of Creativity and Free Expression at Ford. It includes arts, investigative journalism, and film, documentary film, and just delighted to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And Susan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan TaylorBatten, and I'm President and CEO of the Association of Black Foundation Executives. We go by our name, our acronym, ABFE, I should say, and we're a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. And we're based in New York, but I am home in Maryland, right outside of DC. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And I'm based in Los Angeles. I didn't say that about myself. I just want to, before we start into the conversation, I just want to give a little bit of context about this whole movement. When I first met Marta and a lot of the colleagues that are really the core of my friendships, it was because they were heading culturally grounded institutions, culturally sensitive institutions that really spoke for the communities that they represent. And this has been a field that has been, in my opinion, and in many people's opinions, underfunded, undersupported, underrecognized. And you know, it's a 50-year-old movement that, as Marta stated earlier on, really started with the civil rights movement. And given the trajectory of the field, the kinds of arts leaders that it has nurtured, given the artists that have grown through the system, we're find ourselves again talking about how do we sustain these culturally grounded institutions that have just been such a stalwart of the different people that are now the majority minority in the United States. And so the fact that here it is 2020 and we're still having this conversation that Marta and our colleagues were having in the 90s, it's really cause for alarm, and it's really cause for a call to action. And so I just want to sort of give that baseline context. I also wanted to give a little bit of demographic facts and foundation funding facts, again, to have a level playing field. So, according to the Helicon Collaborative, quote, giving to nonprofit arts organizations appears to be highly stratified, with just 2% of arts organizations in the United States receiving more than half of the total contributed income. Between the research that Helicon conducted in 2011 and 2017, they found that overall funding in the nonprofit cultural sector has become less equitable. In that period, it became less equitable. In the US, arts funding for organizations of color stands at 4% of all philanthropic support, yet we make up 37% of the population. They posit, quote, cultural organizations whose primary artistic mission is to serve communities of color or low-income communities face distinctive challenges as a result of their context and lack of capitalization. Further, Create Equity, which is an arts research think tank, which is no longer in existence, but has a web presence, said, quote, there are clear signs that current funding patterns disfavor people of color, rural communities, and low-income neighborhoods. Yet there is still a significant lack of diversity among cultural philanthropic leaders, and that influences funding policies and distributions. This is both at the executive staff and the board level, so as we know. So the conversation today by our cohort of panelists is really intended to not just dwell on past and present funding inequity, but it's hopefully at the end of the day, we're going to be talking about some real ideas and strategies as to how we can better correct what the pattern has been. We know that people who are serving on the panel have been a voice for underserved communities, and we honor their work, which is sometimes very difficult, having been there myself. So without further comment, I'm going to start by posing a question to the panel. So given these troubling and deep-seated funding inequities, how can culturally grounded organizations that were founded in the 60s and 70s transition from project-based, sporadic, and deficient funding support to being seen as the organizational cultural movement that they aspire to be and deserve to be? How can historically underfunded organizations of color in the arts and culture find meaningful and sustainable funding in today's allegedly more culturally aware funding environment? What insights can you bring to this dilemma? At the first panel that we had in this series, which I hope many of you were able to tune into, Claudine Brown, who used to be at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, where Leticia is right now, and was a very well-respected and admired leader, said that funding should be 8 to 10 years in steady investment before any impact could be realized. Leticia, when we spoke previously, you spoke about the concept of a blanket wrapping around our institutions and nurturing them. Can you speak to that, please?
Sure. So I think it's just really important to note that for organizations that are oftentimes white-led, 8 to 10 years of funding is a given. So, you know, I think it's really important to make the distinction between the organizations that we're talking about here on, today, tonight, in this panel. But the question I oftentimes ask myself is, what does true transformation look like, right? Like, what would funding people of color led, Black and Brown, Indigenous led arts, cultural institutions look like if at the center of that, funders, myself included, those of us here on the panel, my colleagues, if we ask ourselves a question, what does it take for transformation, true transformation to happen? What does it mean if the focal point of our funding was less about a project, but more about freedom and liberation and the idea that we're going to win, right? Let's fund like we believe that this work is important. And the reason that I asked myself and I asked my team that question is because I actually do believe that there's some things that we can steal from the right wing. Most of it is bad, but views are my own here. but there's some things that are really important. And it's that they actually do fund in a warm, what I call the warm blanket approach, which means that they fund everything from the scholarship to the think tank to the long-term win. And by long-term, I don't mean 8 to 10 years. I mean, like, what will arts, cultural institutions look like in 15 years, in 20 years? And so I asked myself and our team, if we funded like we believed in freedom, if we believed in transformation and believed in liberation, what would that look like? How would I wrap a warm blanket around the leaders that are creating this work, that are doing this work? How would I think about capacity? How might I think about helping their institutions thrive? How do we understand history and the lack of funding that our communities have gotten, and how do we make up for that, right? So I think less in terms of a project and more in terms of what it would take for Malta or others that are doing this work to not just survive the next economic downturn, but to thrive, to transform, to create, and to show us through the imaginary what is possible. And so for me, I've been calling that internally the warm blanket approach, right? How do we wrap a warm blanket around the people that we care about, that we want to see succeed? But I think, you know, for other communities, this is actually what happens. Funding is given in long-term support to make sure that people have the resources that they need. And I would say that for communities of color, how do we, not just on this panel, but as funders in general, begin to think about what are the resources that are needed if we truly believe that this work is transformational work and needs to be supported like we believe we're going to win.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in on that?
I think if you allow me, Margaret, please.
I would just say quickly, I appreciate Leticia's blanket analogy. There's a credo at Ford that we invest in institutions, ideas, and individuals, sort of the 3 I's. And to that point, there's a new way of investing that we spend 30% of our budget investing in institutions based on their mission. Is their mission aligned with addressing inequality? And, you know, are they doing work that's really impacting the field in some way? And we invest in those institutions. It's called Build. We help them build their institutional capacity. It's not project-related grants, but we help them get stronger. And we primarily give general operating support based on the fact that they're doing work that aligns with our work to address inequality. So that's one example. I know that CERDNA has, Javier Torres there, who's building the arts, a new direction of arts funding there, has a program that does regranting to artists and organizations that are addressing racial justice. And it's now 3 years, but they're trying to extend that. The Build program is 5 years, and those are, I think those are the direction that we're trying to take to address Leticia's brilliant kind of strategy about investing in kind of people and ideas.
Thank you, Margaret. Gonzalo, you had a comment to make?
Yeah, I think, you know, I always like to name the problem before we start looking at solutions. And if we look at, you know, at least organizations in New York City, when you're looking at a cultural organization in New York City, 65% of their funding comes from individual donors, right? And when you look at the same number and a culturally specific organization, that drops to 9%. So in moments like the Great Recession, and also, these culturally specific organizations are always, forced to rely on foundations and government, right? But in moments like the Great Recession, in moments like the pandemic, in which, the funding of a government and foundations may go down, or may need to be spread around more, that's when, our organizations start sort of to suffer. And if you also see that in those two moments, both in the pandemic and during the Great Recession, private wealth has continued to grow, not even decline, continued to grow, then we start saying that, there's a concentration of wealth in our society that is leaving, the very same communities that these organizations of color are serving outside of this opportunity to build wealth, right? And then many of us as funders, we approach communities of colors without understanding this issue, and we try to fund them for like 2 or 3 years, hoping that they become sustainable, when there's no really possibility to become sustainable, right? So how do we help them build wealth? The same way that we would like to see folks in our community to move out of, renting their house and be able to own their house. How do we help cultural organizations, specifically culturally specific organizations, build wealth with the way that we fund them?
Can I jump in, Olga?
Susan?
It's interesting, Gonzalo. I thought when you said that you like to talk about, let's like diagnose the issues and the problems first before you jump in, and I'm so with you. And, I thought you were going to go right to the fact that there's an issue of trust of, people of color-led organizations led by Black folks, Latinx folks, Indigenous folks. And I think we've got a lot of data that suggests that, as a sector, there is an issue of trusting, right, leaders of color with managing resources and being the recipients of grant resources. I think we just have to sort of say that. There's a report that came out a couple of months ago by a group called Echoing Green that looked at the sort of disparities in funding that are well documented as relates to people of color-led organizations, and showed the difference in the unrestricted net assets that white organizations have in comparison to Black organizations. These are Black organizations in particular, like 70% more unrestricted net assets, right, in white organizations than Black organizations over a period of time. And so issues of trust, I think, are just, central to what we're seeing here in terms of the disparities. But the good news is, and what Leticia's got me sort of thinking about, and you all may know, there's a West Coast funder that's got a tagline called "Change, Not Charity," right? So that warm blanket sort of, strategy, funding folks so that they win, reminds me of Liberty Hill's tagline, "Change, Not Charity." And similar to the build, work at Ford, the good news is that there are some foundations that fund like we want people to win, and are even going beyond 3 to 5 year investments. There's one very popular, you all know, social justice organization on the West Coast that's now saying we're going to reduce our national investments and go more local. And these are the examples that we have to pick up and figure out how to spread across the sector.
Let me just, I would just like to say, someone throw me a blanket. I mean, it's like, when first responders come out, they put a blanket on you, make sure you're warm, you're surviving, those sorts of things. Well, hey, we're looking for that blanket. But let me just say that, I think that, this is the time for people to speak up. Dr. Maita, I want to thank you for putting this all together. But, this is the time for us to speak up. It's like, foundations and corporations and everybody expect cultural organizations to do more, to be able to compete with those big institutions. The fact is that, hey, my title may be CEO, and I may be running the National Puerto Rican Museum, but that same title also gives me the responsibility of cleaning bathrooms, of making sure the garbage is out. And so our smaller organizations have to do more, and you expect us to be experts at everything without the funding. So, it's like, let me just say this. I know that one of my colleagues, Perry Urmer, the CEO of the DuSable Museum of African American Art, is watching us. And she always says that, when it comes to government and foundations and everything else, sometimes people need to graduate. That you have some organizations and some museums that have millions and billions of dollars in endowment, in their endowment. If you have millions and billions in your endowment, then you should no longer be receiving any government handouts. And government needs to step up and take that. I mean, people need to graduate. I know in Chicago, when you're a WBE or an MBE, when you get to a certain point, they say, all right, you've reached that level where you are now equal with everybody else. Now you need to graduate. You are no longer part of this program. Well, they need to do that in the arts. They need to do that in the culture or with cultural organizations. We need to make sure that our funds are being spent for those organizations who truly need it.
I also want to jump in here for a minute because, at the Open Society Foundation, I've been able to really do the work of arts and culture through a racial justice lens, right? And so with that, it really gives us a chance to think about arts and cultures as a form of advocacy to really create racial possibilities that we currently haven't imagined. I love the first part of this conversation when we were talking about Claudine Brown and really recognizing the history that got us here, but also the question around the 60s and the 70s, right? So you always have to remind people that we only get to the civil rights movement because of the Harlem Renaissance, right? And there's a way in which we actually have broken narratives, right? So these questions around how race and racial justice happens is oftentimes through the DNA of culture and arts, right? I also think one of the things that we're kind of skirting around is the question of access, right? We have oftentimes segregated communities of color from the wealth belt of philanthropy, right? And so many of us are trying to break that segregation, right? So what does that look like? And I think another reason we are still in this paradigm has a lot to do with whose culture, whose art, right? Because some people are feeling, as was said earlier, maybe resources flowing in their direction because they're affirming a particular cultural artistic expression, right, that the funder can identify with. I would also say, lastly, we're also at this really interesting calibration where people of color have always been cultural producers for the nation state, but rarely have we actually been the resource individuals of those productions, right? So there's a mismatch. And I also think it's really interesting having this conversation right now because, the hotbed issue in this country is around Confederate statues, right? And all the Confederate statues represent are where narrative, art, and public policy meet, right? And it really disrupts people. There's something unveiling about what's underneath that, right? Why do so many white evangelicals love Confederate statues when they have nothing to do with religion, right? Because it's the cultural imprint. And it's the cultural imprint that I think these groups are really trying to disrupt and expand. So I just want to move us in that direction too. Thanks.
Thank you, Alvin. I just wanted to give one more quote before we get to the next question, which is, as reported by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, quote, organizations led by people of color with less grant money and are trusted less to make decisions about how to spend those funds than groups with white leaders. So this is, again, systemic, right? It's not, every once in a while. So this is a systemic way of undercapitalizing, underfunding the organizations that are created by our communities and speak for our communities and serve our communities. So we have been focusing now, the first part of the discussion has been on these legacy organizations like the Caribbean Cultural Center, like so many, like Museo de la Raza here in Los Angeles, Puerto Rican National Museum that you had, Alvin, and so I'm not Alvin, I'm sorry. Which one? Billy. Let's talk about younger organizations that are just coming in or have recently emerged that are dealing with, the issues that are really important. So it's not just like a black and white issue any longer. We're really talking about Black and African descent, but also Latinx, Native, Arab, Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander, Appalachian, LGBTQIA plus, and people with disabilities. The table has gotten much bigger in the more recent years. How do we sustain our legacy institutions that were started in the 60s and the 70s as a result of the civil rights movements in the various different communities, Chicano movement, etc.? How do we bring these new organizations, emerging organizations that are really speaking to today's issues to the table and make room for them and provide funding support and equitable funding support for them? So Margaret had, when we had a conference call to talk about how to do this panel, you spoke about sort of impediments that are built into the system, like we can only fund at a certain level given your budget size, or other issues that imperil equity. I would love for you to deepen that conversation, but I'd also like the entire panel to talk about, what is the new reality here. It's really diversity is the issue.
Yeah, and I think it might have been Leticia and I were kind of riffing back and forth, but we recognize there are these practices that have been part of the legacy of philanthropy, that philanthropy wants to have big impact, and they have historically funded large organizations at a significant amount or percentage in order for them to have the impact that they want to see. So the size of the organization is key, and that, of course, is an immediate limitation and prescription for emerging organizations of color and even long-term organizations of color that can never accumulate the wealth and capitalization they need to really thrive. The other thing, or another related issue, is tipping, which is really a kind of a tax implication that that guides how much a nonprofit gets or amasses in terms of public contributions, and the form of, and that gets from private foundations, and it tends to limit or it suggests that we should limit how large grant size we give to smaller organizations, lest we put them at risk of losing temporarily their 501c3 status. But it's almost a term of art that is not well understood even by grant makers. I have to say what's interesting about this discussion is along with some other foundations, someone has organized for us a program to speak with a tax attorney to help us have strategies that are designed to fund smaller organizations because of this sort of tipping, I would say myth almost, but that tipping and budget size has been something that has historically limited the size of grants that philanthropy, is practices with smaller organizations, including organizations of color.
Yeah, I think that those kind of structural baked in challenges are have prevented both legacy organizations and more recent organizations from getting the kind of sustainable support that they need to be stable and to grow. Other people have comments on this?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in just quickly. I think a lot about tipping and the rules that we learn when we get into philanthropy, right? I always say that for people of color, philanthropy can be a traumatic experience. So make sure that you have your community of folks to keep you grounded and sane, or private philanthropy, anyways. But I think that that sure there are true tax implications for some of these rules, especially for the organizations that we're funding. And there's also like something that we should call is that there's like funder bad behavior, right? And so I think both for us to think about how do we as the funding community also recognize that we're steeped in an industry that was naturally extractive and isn't created for transformation, right? Like that is not the way that the industry was created. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't shift the master's tools, right? Like it doesn't mean that we can't begin to think about ways to undo the harm that philanthropy has done in communities of color. But I do think acknowledging and recognizing that many of the tools that we're given when we enter are not tools that are here to create transformative experiences or processes for communities of color. And so, many of us that work in the field spend a lot of time organizing internally and talking about these issues and thinking about how do we undo some of the harm? How do we repair? How do we bring up? How do we change the rules? But I do think it's important that that we acknowledge that the industry itself is an industry that was born out of charity, right? It's an industry that was created to give certain people tax shelters, right? If we look at the history of that in the United States, again, I don't believe that means that my work is futile internally. I do think it means that it grounds me in understanding that the tools that are here for me to use are probably not in full service of the communities that I want to work on behalf of, right? That means that Alvin and I and others have to think through what might the strategies look like? Who do we need to bring in? Who do we count on? And I also want to say, I say this all the time, to my colleagues, like, stop asking me to talk about general operating support on these panels. That's important, and that's old news. Of course, we should be funding people general operating support. Of course, that's what we should be doing. I want to talk about the next level of transformation. I want to talk about what's next. So it isn't that that is happening all around, but I want us to dream a little more, dream a bit bigger of what's possible for our communities. So I'll leave it there.
But Leticia, when we talked previously, and you touched on it earlier, it really caught my attention when you said right-wing organizations start with providing funding support to seed an idea, then they give funding support to bring it to scale. Then they start thinking about how does that leader transition to his or her next level of involvement, and how do you bring in the successive leader? And that sort of blanket, as you said earlier, like almost cradle to grave strategy of providing funding support, but not just funding support. It's ideological support and strategic support and political support. I find that is absent in the way that the arts and culture funding environment has developed here. That we're so sort of freaked out about, and I think that there's many geopolitical reasons for this, but we're so scared to fund and trust artists that we don't provide, that's almost like money that is so limited that we will never get to that level of sustainability that we're all seeking here, right? And so I'd love to have other panelists weigh in on that assessment.
I would just say that I think there's a few things here. I think that one is that we have to fund professionalism. More and more of our young people of color are going into the arts world, but are they getting the opportunity once they once they've gotten their degree and they have all these loans, are they getting that opportunity to them implement what they've learned? And, I think foundations and corporations and everybody else needs to fund professionalism. I mean, how do we grow an organization? How do we keep them? Because we may be a small institution that may not have the kind of budget to keep around those young professionals of color. So we need to, look at that. The other thing we need to take a look at is funding diversity. We've been talking about, if you go for the last 10 years, you go to conferences, any conference you go to, all they do is talk about, we need to talk about diversity, we need to talk about inclusion, we need to talk about equity. But it's been talked for the last 10 years. Now it's time to make it happen. It's time to make it happen. And it's time to look at our organizations of color are already diverse. We have everything you're looking for, everything you've been talking about for the last 10 years, we have it. Now we need that funding to be there in order for us to grow and in order for us to show everyone else, because, you have other institutions that are not institutions of color that are taking our place. They are now presenting the Latino art world. They are now presenting the Black art world. And yet here we are, the ones who are really Black and the ones that are really Latino and not having the funding to present. So, I think that foundations, corporations, government needs to take a bigger responsibility and play a bigger role with museums of color.
Anyone?
I just on the issue of emerging organizations and the like, just a tip about and many know this, that there is an infrastructure to the sector, right? And part of the challenge is that this is a sector that's not necessarily easy to penetrate. It's always about relationships. People tend to generally give money to people that they know. And I just want to put a plug in for some of the organizations that, always staying hopeful. I do think provide spaces for smaller organizations to perhaps connect with resources. They are groups like Neighborhood Funders Group. There are groups like Funders for LGBTQ Issues, Hispanics in Philanthropy, ABFE. Many of these organizations actually are funders themselves because oftentimes institutionalized philanthropy just can't get the job done, can't get the money to the ground. And so
Yep.
Understanding the infrastructure and perhaps getting connected a bit more, the burden should not be on folks that are doing the work, but just understanding these organizations that are out there, these philanthropy serving organizations, is just another way for newer organizations that are coming online to understand different ways in which money flows, not just from funders, but often through these organizations that serve as intermediaries that are much closer to the community, in my opinion.
So Susan, as I was getting, prepared for this panel, I found a quote from you where you say, quote, "Our organizations are underfunded and for that reason have smaller staffs, smaller budgets, and little or no operating reserves. We call it philanthropic redlining." Could you expound on that? That kind of, what you just said sort of leads into that whole concept of a systemic underfunding, or I think it's just lack of paying attention and lack of acknowledging that there is a real issue. The fact that, philanthropy, and by the way, I'm going to get to the government side in a little while, so stay tuned for that. But the fact is that the wealth has been amassed by, a white system that has been privileged throughout the history of this country. And, more and more people are pointing to the fact that there are things like redlining and Gonzalo said earlier about lack of our communities to build wealth in the first place, et cetera. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And, we, I think it was 2 years ago, we actually talked to about just under 100 Black-led nonprofits, not just in the arts and culture space, but Black-led nonprofits, mostly movement organizations, generally around the country, just to get a sense of their experiences with philanthropy. Our membership at ABFE actually includes nonprofits because we don't think we can transform philanthropy without engaging people who actually do the work, right, that philanthropy is supporting. So, we did a number of interviews and conversations to talk about their experiences with philanthropy. And, we took the redlining sort of frame from the mortgage finance industry, that there are policies and practices, and we've been talking about them, that advantage white homeowners or white-led organizations over organizations that are led by Black folks, or let me say people of color generally. And, we've been talking about the funding disparities. They're pretty well documented. You started off, Olga, with some quotes there. And basically what we heard, and we're lifting it up from a number of nonprofits, again, Black nonprofits, were, again, the practices and policies that stop funding from reaching smaller organizations more connected to community. Denied due to capacity, right? The big capacity issue. I think it was mentioned earlier that, organizations can't take or can't be granted large, sums of money, and not necessarily just for the tipping issue, but because there's no quote unquote track record or capacity in receiving funds from foundations of that size. Burdensome reporting requirements. We actually had some colleagues talk to us about what they called philanthropic Black codes, actually. Arduous, and this is difficult to hear in this day and time, monthly, some required for monthly finance reports, right? Surprise site visits. Things that literally, are concerning as relates to bias. And again, I sort of go back to issues of lack of trust. And so we know that, and Leticia hit it again, for a sector that wasn't necessarily designed to facilitate, support, achieve liberation and freedom, For those who have been marginalized, oppressed, and controlled in this country, there are a host of practices that many are working on, that we have to continue to work on. You know, I am always trying to be optimistic on these issues, Olga, and I do think that some of the strategies around surprisingly called trust-based philanthropy now, but participatory grant making, ways in which funders are working to move the decision-making outside of the role and responsibility of the funder itself, but to a broader group of community leaders to move resources. I mean, there are some things that are being tried. I mean, we just got to figure out how to move those practices across the sector more intentionally.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I just want to jump in briefly because I also think that there is philanthropic work to do, right, to solve this issue. Something that we're also not naming is this false idea of scarcity, right? And the idea here is that there's just not enough for everyone, right? And that's just not true, right? Foundations, we've created our own guidelines. We have created what it is that we want to see. So the question becomes, how do you redesign the work to really create equity? This other point that I think is really interesting around newer organizations and whether or not we can fund them, you know, it also comes back to a narrative framework, right? In other spaces, we would assume that these are big bets, innovation grants, right? That's how we open up the door of opportunity for individuals that we haven't seen before. But when people of color show up without the kind of pedigree, with a background, you know, we have a risk management analysis, which is completely, of course, unfair. But I also think you find long-term people of color groups who would also say that they have felt a ceiling to actually how far they can grow, right? So there's this way in which there's this trap door that is always in process for communities of color, in particular around the kind of cultural art space. And so we have to figure out, how do we dismantle that? Like, what is our efforts to really create new opportunities, right? So funders could create, you know, an innovation grant for communities of color looking at a specific regional area, right? It's really around the design, but I would also say crafting the internal political will, which is always an organizing methodology.
Let me just add to Alvin's point there. And I want to add to it because I think that, you know, Alvin makes a very good point, which is that funders can. They can. And we've seen it this year during this whole COVID-19. They've made a lot of changes, you know, changes you have not seen in the last 10, 20 years. So they stepped up in a lot of ways. They've stepped up and said, okay, wait up, we got to make sure these organizations survive. They threw out their guidelines. You know, some of the foundations have done that. And so we know that they can. Now, the thing is, do they have the will to sustain that? Because if they have the will to sustain it, then organizations of color have a bright future ahead of them.
So that brings me to a question. I'm sort of skipping around my questions just as you know, natural curve of your discussion takes place. But, you know, Margaret, there have been a number of collaborative efforts on the foundation front announced recently. One of the major ones, of course, was led by Ford, where $156 million is going to be invested in sort of national America's treasures, which are the top tier organizations of color in the country. So I'd love for you to talk about that. How were those chosen? Will there be a second cohort? How will the regional effort take place? And then what are some of the other, you know, because I have to say, when I was in philanthropy, I was the founding director of the Doris Charitable Foundation's arts program. And, you know, so I lived in New York for 10 years, and there wasn't a lot of collaboration amongst foundations at that time, I have to say. And I think that this is, finally falling into place, that foundations are saying, we don't need to be so precious. We don't need to be like, oh my God, I came up with this wonderful idea. And it's like, how do we join resources? How do we work together to achieve what we're trying to achieve? So, Margaret, can you unpack that a little bit?
So I've enjoyed this discussion because I felt a little like an outlier here. I actually, I used to work in Gonzalo's agency, and I actually have an arts budget that's really a fraction of New York City's arts budget. Our foundation is dedicated to social justice, and our arts budget is not huge, but we make it go far. I will say, to your point about America's Treasures, that was a leadership initiative by our president. To the point of going beyond and challenging the 5% payout. He went to our board, during the height of the pandemic, and fought to lift that 5% ceiling or 6% ceiling to be able for us to spend or to pay out more than 10%. He also encouraged other foundations to do the same because of the devastation that we were seeing. Before America's Treasures, we collaborated with funders in New York City to really help stabilize organizations in New York City with a large relief effort. America's Treasures is a little bit of a narrative to play off Alvin's this idea that we want to look at those organizations of color that have contributed to the heritage and the culture of this country and help them, and as a relief effort, invest in them. There is a national component, 20 organizations that have been selected. But the other part of it, again, being led by our president, is to challenge other foundations across the country to invest in organizations of color. And that investment is based on contributing $5 million toward their effort. They must match that $5 million. And there are 11 funders throughout the country that are now planning with other foundations to fund organizations of color in their communities, in cities and states, including Los Angeles and Houston and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. The idea is to raise the visibility of those organizations so that more foundations will either fund more deeply these organizations, to your point, that have really operated for 50 years or more, but to fund more deeply in them, or to fund them for the first time. And that's, kind of an example of what we were able to do by kind of piercing that that 5% limit.
So thank you, Margaret. One of the things that keeps coming up, because I'm in a lot of different conversations, both local, national, and international. I do a lot of international work. But, one of the things that I really want you guys to also address is how do we make space at the policy table for the workers who are leading these organizations, these legacy organizations of color and the newer ones, so that they're part of the future thinking. They're part of, so it's not this just closeted, kind of behind the scenes foundation effort, but it's really about, including the people that You know, they're the ones that are waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and saying, how am I going to make payroll? How am I going to keep the lights on? How am I going to move this organization, or, you know, keep it running during these horrific times? What are some of the leadership initiatives that are taking place, and how do we really invite the people who are in the front lines to help us think through these terrible times? Alvin, you're shaking your head. Why don't you take a crack at it?
Yeah, I will open this up, and I'm shaking my head because I could not agree more, right? What we know is that cultural workers are also some of the most vulnerable employees in the U.S.
Right.
And so your question for me made me reflect upon a conversation that I had recently around how do we even provide insurance for artists, right? To have the time, the respite, to have either sabbaticals, for their teams to replenish themselves. Many of these organizations and institutions have been devastated by the COVID pandemic, right? Leading to extraordinary layoffs, and also frequently leaving communities without refuge for cultural engagement, right? So I do think there's this way in which, you know, we don't talk about how do we create a inclusive, dare I say, arts New Deal that even goes beyond what we currently have in place, right? And who puts that on the table? Because I do think, and I can only talk from the space of philanthropy at this moment, how do we bring reimagination, or even just basic imagination, to the philanthropic sphere, right? What does that kind of cumulative demand look like that allows us to really see the vibrancy and the professionalism and the long-term work of cultural artists? I also think we don't talk enough about the burnout, right? Because the philanthropic chase is exhausting, right? It is exhausting, right? And we are oftentimes asking communities of color to be martyrs, right? Which is not fair, right? Because underneath it is there's so much important, and then the word magic comes up. There is so much important magic that communities of color are asked to produce, but very rarely are we receiving any praise for that level of production.
Anybody else want to chime in? Gonzalo?
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit, you know, to follow up what Alvin is saying also, without, by risking to sounding naive, is that also the problem is changing the language, right? When it comes to cultural specifics, a lot of people in philanthropy speak, you know, about the deficits and not the assets, right? And having worked in culturally specific organizations, small and medium, in a really large mainstream organization, I can tell you how resourceful we can be when we're pressed, you know, for that, and the impact that you have because you're so tight and connected to community, right? And that's also sometimes almost forgotten. The focus is, you know, we need to help them, you know, they're struggling, as opposed to saying, you know, we need to really invest in the work that they're doing because it's valuable. And then somebody recently told me and correct me, which is we should even rethink, you know, the term culturally specific, because we use it, you know, for Black and brown organizations. But what if we start looking at the opera and the Philharmonic as a culturally specific organization, and we should start funding them at the same level, you know, that Black and brown organizations are funded, right? And how, you know, that sort of euphemism and changes completely.
Okay, so now I'm going to. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this question? Okay, so I have to give a commercial. which is to say that on October 27th, which is next Tuesday, same time, 6:30 Eastern Daylight Time, we will be having our last panel, which is, as you see, when the law is not the law. And it's being moderated by Esmeralda Simmons and Isis Raskia Mattel, both of them lawyers. And that panel will be delving into, sort of the implications of what are the legal underpinnings of why the system is the way it is, and how can we dismantle that so that we can move towards cultural and economic equity in the way that we work. I also want to remind people that to use the chat function to pose questions, so that as we start coming to an end of the discussion, the formal discussion with the panel, we can take some questions from the audience. So please make sure that you start putting in the questions that have been, bubbling up. Okay. I want to turn it a little bit now. I mean, we've been really framing this the conversation very much from a sort of private philanthropy point of view. And I want to turn more to, what is the government or, public funding? What are their particular responsibilities? What do they bring to the table in our society? What thought leadership should we be expecting from the public sector? What kind of funding participation? I mean, Gonzalo, obviously New York is a huge outlier in terms of how much money it invests in the arts as compared to anywhere else in this country. But Billy, you are an elected official in Chicago, which also has a very deep-rooted history of funding in the arts, both from the private sector and the public sector. Let's turn the conversation a little bit about what should we be expecting as citizens, as taxpayers, from the people we elect and from the agencies that are doing our bidding, if you will, in terms of, we are now a majority minority nation. What's going on?
What I would say that, one, we should be expecting more. Given the world today, given the fact that it's not just been COVID-19, but the whole Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, that has taught everybody so much about what the world is like today, and that there is still systemic racism. And so government needs to pay attention to those things. And I would just say that, when it comes to the art world, people believe our artists more than they believe politics. And so if anybody's going to tell the story, if anybody can tell the story and say it in a way that is that people are going to say, that has credibility behind it, we're part of that, we agree with them, it's going to be the art world. People don't trust government, they just don't. And so I just think that government needs to do more, especially in today's day and age when you have so much going on. It's like people, and like I said earlier, if government takes steps, everyone else will take steps. Foundations have started to take a step this year. The whole Black Lives Matter got everybody rethinking how this world works. And so I think that government takes a step, foundations are going to take a step, and because government and foundations are taking a step, corporations are going to take a step. And the truth is that, our communities of color do not have the millionaires. We don't have the billionaires that are going to be able to give these dollars to our organizations. We have to depend on others who are out there. What we need to do is speak up. Thank you.
Gonzalo, you want to weigh in?
Yes, of course. I think, one of the things I've been talking to my staff is, we like to pride ourselves, as you said, Olga, one of the largest municipal funders of arts in the country. But I've been saying that there are problems, and we're facing many of those problems that, it's not necessarily about funds, it's about, so many other things. There are problems that you can only solve by just throwing money at them. And at the same time, the power that, a municipality like New York has. So what is our role as a convener? What is our role as an advocate? And my predecessor, Tom Finkelpel, when he took over the agency, he did something that it was unexpected and that made a lot of people very nervous, but it was installing the conversation about diversity and equity in the arts by just quantifying, the problem. We all knew that, it was completely in the demographics on our cultural organizations were completely off. But, the fact that somebody comes in and, with the government and with the power that, the agency has, quantifies that and says, this is not okay and we need to work toward that, is in some ways has put us in this path in which we continue to improve, these issues of equity. Similarly, we released, early this summer, an early report on the impact of that the pandemic has had on cultural organizations. And our impetus was not only to inform our work, and I can tell you a little bit more what we're doing ourselves, but also to help, private philanthropy to understand, what was happening and how they could direct, their funds in a way that it was more productive. And then, in particular, I'm very proud that, this happened before I came in. I've been only in my position for 4 or 5 months. But a group of my staffers decided 3 years ago to do a study of what are the barriers to access public funds, right? It's not only about how much you give to organizations and to give more to organizations of color, but, like, what are the barriers that, are precluding these organizations to even write an application? Right, and I'm very proud to say that very soon we're going to announce some of those barriers and what are the recommendations that we're going to follow in terms, to open up this funding.
Thank you.
Yeah, Olga.
Yes.
Yeah, I just jumping in to say that I just think that public funding for the arts is underappreciated, undervalued, and especially relative to philanthropy. I think it's the most important funding that the arts and cultural organizations can have. It's more likely to be guaranteed. It's more likely to be scrutinized by the public and by taxpayers. I've seen cities that don't have public funding for the arts, and in those cities, organizations of color particularly are just very weak, very fragile. And I also want to sort of just commend Tom's leadership and your leadership, Gonzalo, for fighting the right fight on diversifying, organizations that have overlooked diversity for forever. So yeah, I just think philanthropy is viewed almost in too heavily in a positive way versus public funding for the arts.
I this morning I had been invited to be a guest at a university in Southern California arts journalism class that had a number. There's about 15 or 16 graduate students, and some of whom were not at all in the arts. So we started talking about some of these issues of what has been happening in our field over the last 30 years or so. And I remember as a young arts administrator in Miami, that in the mid 80s, the National Endowment for the Arts took an extreme leadership role in bringing together people of color, both artists and arts administrators, into decision-making roles and policy-making roles who had been completely out of the system prior to that. And they, in my opinion, and I was privy to it, and Yvonne Coleman, A.B. Spellman, Bentil, the people who have been named already here were very much at the forefront of that. And it was really a time when our primary federal government agency was saying, we need to do a better job of including diverse voices. We need to have more representation from communities outside of the sort of the cultural capitals as they still exist now, right? We need to have voices from the South. We need to have voices from rural areas. We need to have voices from, really not just Black and white, but, Latinx and Asian and Indigenous, et cetera. And that was in like the mid 80s. And then the culture wars hit in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was like immediately, in my perception, that conversation and that movement was dropped because it was all about saving the agency as a whole from the threat that, the Jesse Helms of the world were placing on it. And it was almost like there was this like leadership suction that occurred in that time, where that whole idea that a new pluralism and cultural movement needed to really be embraced by the top cultural agency of our country. And I don't think that's ever come back. I don't think that's ever come back. And so much emphasis has been put on the funding component, and yet the thought leadership and the sort of trend setting or leadership role has not really been dissected. It hasn't been at the forefront of the discussion, and I'm just wondering what you guys think about that.
So I'd like to go back to a point, Olga, that you when we were having a conversation of the panel, that I brought up about the way that the right wing oftentimes funds, and I think it's relevant to your question. I think this idea that on the progressive, both philanthropy, but also the progressive movement, and there's this sort of assumption that leadership or leaders or thought scholarship, right? It just sort of happens, right? There's like really smart people, there's really artistic people, they're amazing, and it just happens. And there's some really great research on the amount of money that progressive organizations invest in leadership development and how it's dwarfed by right-leaning conservative organizations, because there's an understanding that leadership actually and thought scholarship doesn't just happen, that it's groomed and that it's given space and that it's supported, and that we have to create the places and the spaces for scholarship and thought leadership and the forums for it to happen. And so I do think it's important for us to think about, I have a theory which I won't share here necessarily about why that is, but I do think it's important for us to think about that, there isn't, it doesn't just happen. Like we don't, whether it's leaders in philanthropy, or leaders in anywhere else in the arts, like what is the responsibility of whether it's the public or the private sector to really invest in leaders, both for our institutions now, but can we get out of our own way to imagine what our institutions might look like, like my funder colleague Tia says, 7 generations in the future, right? Like, is there an opportunity for us to think about, there's an opportunity to invest in the future leaders of this work, to make sure that there's that when the opportunity comes in, that we have the people to take over. And I'll just use an example not from the arts, but we've been watching the Supreme Court confirmation of who will probably be the next Supreme Court justice. And if you look at the trajectory of her career, it's been a humongous investment to get her to this place, both by think tanks, scholarship, universities, organizations. And so I just, I would ask us the question, those of us that are on the progressive end, what will it take for us to really think about, there's investment in organizations, there's investment in the infrastructure, but also there has to be an investment in the leaders and the thought scholarship, right? The thought partnership that needs to be in place to be ready for when we are all moving out of the way, right? When we're all retiring, I always say, like, who's gonna take over when I am like dancing salsa or dancing bomba in my retirement home? I wanna make sure that I'm investing in that future as well.
So that brings us back a little bit to the whole leadership question and the succession question. Did anybody want to weigh in on that? Maybe Susan, you haven't said anything for a little while. Why don't we go to you?
No, but I would just sort of co-sign on the notion that when we think about, building sort of, whether it's arts and culture infrastructure, neighborhood and community infrastructure, there's just got to be more thinking about leadership. We just pivot directly to, the notion of institution building, because that's important. But really, when we talk about change and using the tools of arts and creative talent, we're talking about people. And so I just, agree with the fact that we've got to be thinking about leadership support. It was raised earlier in terms of the ability for leaders to have time to think, and notion of sabbaticals. I think there's more sort of happening in philanthropy around funding sabbaticals just generally for community leaders. So there are, the good news is that there are sort of strategies and models out there that we can again deploy.
Well, like I said earlier, I was the founding director, program director for the arts at the Doris Charitable Foundation. And at the time that I was there like 8 years, and on more than one occasion, the CEO sort of intimated, or actually came out and said, that I was privileging Latinx organizations over other organizations because I'm a Latina. And, it was very easy statistically to prove that that was not the case. And yet that was sort of a built-in prejudice that was, it was like not even a big thing for her to say that with little repercussion, which, harkens back to the whole idea of how do we create an expectation that it's not okay for only, I think it's 20% of senior staff at foundations to be people of color, and let alone boards of directors, which is even less of a playing field for us. What are some of the ways that we can think about, really challenging that scenario and building, again, the statistics show that even though there have been initiatives announced by the Council on Foundations and other bodies to say that, building diversity both at the staff level and the board level is a mandate and it's a priority. The needle has not changed. The needle has not moved. Now given all of the racial protests that have really been, so many people have participated in from all different communities. There's hopefully a different level of awareness and a different level of expectation that has been built in terms of how our society functions. I'd love to hear from you all about, this is a moment that, if we lose this moment, shame on us. How do we work to utilize this moment to build more diversity in the decision making of both foundations and government, and especially government, which is supposed to be about the people. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Again, Alvin is shaking his head, so I
have to stop shaking my head.
And then I'll ask Gonzalo to step in.
Yeah, well, I want to build on some of the pieces of our previous conversation, because I think it's so smart on here. I think in particular, communities of color were only allowed one level of representation, right? There's this idea that either we're monolithic or you can only have one Latinx organization, one indigenous organization. And to Leticia's point, when you look at something like the Federalist Society, right, it wants everyone, right? It wants as many people as possible, right? And it goes back to this mythology of scarcity. Like there can only be one person of color or one person of color institution. But when we look on the opposite side of the fence, it's bountiful, right? And so I'm trying to figure out how to get to the bountiful side, right? Not necessarily that political framework, but how do we shift even our own internal thinking? I think many of us inside institutions feel, and this is just, how racial threat operates oftentimes, if I stand up for addressing issues of anti-Black racism, then I'm somehow not considering other racial ethnic groups. It's just not true, right? It's just not, and it's also radically unfair, but that's actually how, racism exists in our DNA, as well as inside our institutions. To get directly to your question here, I think it's also about how do we create pipelines, right? How do we create real pipelines that consciously and purposefully disrupts segregation?
Look, let me just add, I think that, look, I couldn't have gotten the National Puerto Rican Museum to where we're at today without foundations, without government, without corporations. I couldn't have gotten us there. They've all played a role. And I thank them for playing that role that they played in our history. But the fact is that the world is changing, and that we need to take a look at it from a different lens at this point, that the status quo can no longer be the same anymore. We need to, just as Ford Foundation did, going from 5% to 10%, you know what a big difference that is? Imagine if every foundation and every corporation would just make 1 or 2 percentage points difference. I mean, I prefer that they make a 10% difference, but that 1 or 2% is able to reach more organizations, is able to give a voice to people who have been struggling to just stay alive. And so, it's just that we have to do more than what we've done in the past, is basically what I'm saying. It's up to them. It's their responsibility to now say, the world is changing. How do we change with that world?
Gonzalo, you wanted to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this morning was a hearing at the City Council here in New York City to speak about these very same issues, and I was reflecting what needed to happen in order for somebody like me, with all the privilege that I have, right? But still, somebody like me to be able to access to a position of power like the one I have today, right? And it was the work of, Marta Moreno Vega and so many other Latinx leaders that, for so many years, we're not going to say how many, have been clearing the space. And the question to me, so what's next? And, I wanted to connect and emphasize something that Leticia said, is that, then when we're putting in the system, we're shocked, right? There's such an sort of organizational cultures, systems. The whole system is not ready for people that wants to come and create change. And it could be very isolating. It could be very very traumatic, as Leticia said. And I think, that's the next big, accomplishment, right? If we look at the prior generation building the space and creating the training grounds for us to be able to access the system from within, how do we change the system? How do we create, structural systemic change?
Olga, I would share too, just to build on this. I've been watching Philanthropy, and particularly in the state of California, that has been very intentional about changing who's making decisions in foundations there. And it has been over a period of time. But this is about organizing, just like it is about making change anywhere else, right? And so we have been, matter of fact, tomorrow kicks off our national Leverage the Trust Retreat, which is our annual retreat of Black Foundation trustees. We've been organizing Black trustees for about the past 5 years. In California, interestingly enough, it was very intentional by a group of Black trustees across a number of foundations in this country, in the state rather, which is why most of the major philanthropies in California are now run by a person of color, and most of them now Black, right? And they have been intentional about this, and it played out over the course of several years. So again, organizing, having a plan to change what leadership at the governance level and the C-suite looks like in philanthropy actually does work if we are intentional about it. And it's so interesting that, you got called on by your boss in terms of preferencing Latino organizations. We have a fellowship program at ABFE, right? We've got over 150, smart, brilliant, mid-career Black folks in the sector that have gone through our fellowship program. And one of the things that we say to them when they come into the fellowship is, and this is unfortunate, but this is the hard truth of what somebody told me when I came into a foundation and came into the fellowship so many years ago. The likelihood of you being promoted is slim to none, so you better rock the boat right where you are. And yes, you preference Black organizations, you preference Latino-led organizations, Indigenous organizations. That's the role that we play. That's the role that we have while we're in these, in these institutions. Unfortunately, they are tough institutions. I love the colleagues that are on this call, but you all know philanthropy looks like community foundations and family foundations for the most part around the country, right? And they can be extremely isolating and very tough for folks to be in. And so we don't retain a lot of the talent that we have or bring into the sector. But what we try to do is, again, sort of give folks the support to be as courageous as they can be while they're in, and then organize at the top, because we see that it does work if you're intentional about who's sitting in the boardrooms and ultimately who's in that C-suite. It can be done.
I think that, again, my observation was that people who serve on these boards, they had to have some sort of access to the person who built that wealth, right? And, guess what? That's mostly white folks that also come from wealth. And so the changing that paradigm so that, because my analysis is that, private philanthropy is a nonprofit situation, right? They don't have to pay taxes because they're giving service to the community. That means that billions of dollars are taken out of the tax roll because these organizations are supposed to be providing a public service. That means that in my book, that means that they have to represent the people whose tax base is being depleted, right? Yet there's not any accountability per se. And so again, it seems like this is a time that we need to have those hard conversations about what is equitable, you know, who are we as a country, who's making the decisions, and how do we infiltrate those decision-making bodies so that there is representation as these resources are being meted out. And I don't know, I'd love to hear what you guys think about that analysis.
I would just say quickly, sort of going back to this question about leadership and what's happened, who's stepping up to be a leader. I feel like we've seen over this past year a lot of leaders stepping up within the arts community and taking power, doing it collectively and not waiting their turn to be polite. It feels that way to me, and I hope that this is the new face of kind of leaders who will step into our roles and be on boards and lead organizations. I mean, we've seen it in, among the Broadway community, the artists of color, just forming a coalition and stepping up to Broadway to say, you're racist, you've got to change. We've seen it in the theater community with the Black Seed Initiative, headed by Indira Itarahu and theater leaders across the country who just stepped up and said, we're going to start to fund smaller theaters of color because no one else is doing it. We see it in museums with a lot of these reckonings among curatorial staff and others, both white and people of color. I just hope that this is not a chapter, because it just feels to me that there is kind of a leadership dynamic that is just not taking any more and really challenging white supremacy and old ways of doing business. And I don't know about others. I'd be curious about others, whether they think this is a chapter or whether we're seeing change happen.
I see Billy shaking his head. Billy, you want to?
Well, I mean, for me, it's just, that depends on us. It really does depend on us, the organizations, the artists, to continue to speak up. I mean, it's a time to challenge. It's a time to make people think. It's a time to make people reimagine what's there today. And so we have to keep the pressure on. Yes, we're going to make a lot of people feel uncomfortable, but if the good comes out of that, if the change comes out of that, then it's our responsibility to do these things. And so, I would say, I hope it's not just a chapter. I hope that it's people really speaking their minds, speaking the truth, and truth will prevail. And so, I mean, for me, I have hope in our people.
Gonzalo, you look like you wanted to chime in.
I just wanted to add to what Margaret said, that I agree with her that, we're seeing change in leadership, also in mainstream organizations. The challenge is how we support our, fellow, creative leaders, because we're seeing also that as they're being asked to take over, mainstream organizations, at the same time, they're being asked to exercise a kind of leadership that is usually
with no money.
With no money, but also a kind of leadership that is expected, from the cisgender white men, right? The charismatic leadership. And we're seeing women, by PLC folks that they bring a collective leadership and leadership that is about, embracing everyone. And sometimes that is seen as weak. sentences that's seen as not being decisive, and they're being set to failure. That's why I mean, we're in a moment that if we're infiltrating ourselves in the system, but the system needs to change in order to support the change that we want to see.
Anyone else want to add their 2 cents?
No, that's just it's a good point, Gonzalo. It's are we seeing a transfer of leadership to people of color at a time when resources are more limited? It's COVID and organizations are Black and or disrupted. Yeah, it's a very tricky time.
So
I also go ahead.
Go ahead, Alvin.
Go ahead, Alvin.
I just want to be very quick to Margaret's point, because I think we are seeing a transfer of leadership, but I also think we want a transfer of power, right? And I think that is also underneath what's holding this space back, right? Like, we don't want to see leadership perpetuate inequalities, right? We are really looking for something much more transformative than what we've seen in the past. And to your point, I think we feel that this is a movement, not a moment. But I think for all of us, the question becomes like, well, how do we carry and nurture that movement forward so that it actually has the resources? And I also want to say this, and also the ability to fail. Very rarely do people of color organizations get a chance to fail and not have it be weaponized against them, right? I have a colleague who talks about the fact that white organizations and white leaders can actually fail up.
Yeah, and white men in particular.
Yes, white men in particular, right? Where humans of color, you fall out, right? You just like, there is nowhere else. You're just out of the game permanently. So there is so much here around power dynamics that we also
Alvin,
have
I
to
would
really
say,
bring to
and if that sort of organization of color fails and the program officer is a person of color, then it's got a double sort of hit, because then, you become, and all of us that have been, program officers and staff within foundations know that,
Yep.
if it goes down with the Black organization, it's, the entire race goes down, right? So it's about power and who has privilege. Absolutely.
So I just want to just really quick point. I mean, I think I want to bring back my original opening point. The first question is how do we fund and how do we support as if we believe that we can win, right? That we believe that transformation is possible. And I like what I hear and what all my colleagues are saying is that, right? Is that we actually have to transform the way that we're doing it and the conversations that we're having. But also, there's some really interesting research about when people of color take over, right? Like this question of like, Obama was elected and like the economy was in the garbage, right? And that isn't that different than in other in other sectors when all of a sudden, to Alvin's point, you have a person of color take over, and yet they're the leader, but there's no power, right, there to sort of make the changes that are needed. And so I just, invite us. I really do invite us to think about what would the funding strategies, government and private, look like in creating a creative economy if we believe that transformation was possible when we centered the leadership and the primacy right, of Black, Brown, Indigenous people at the center, that does require incredible organizing from those of us that are inside. But I think it also requires different conversations in terms of how we relate to philanthropy, who's at the table. And I'll just say, you know, I'm in philanthropy because of an amazing, you know, Boricua woman who saw me in a fellowship program and said, you need to come and work at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with me. So I don't think Deborah Joy Perez is on the line, but just in case she is, big shout out to her. And I'm not the only one, right? There's a bunch of us that were sort of led into the fold and taught how to engage, exist, navigate, and survive, because there was someone there to shepherd us in. And I believe that she understands that transformation is possible. And so I would just invite us to really think about what would that look like, both for the funders, but also for the ways that we engage in providing the spaces and places for people to thrive.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, the only reason that I even came to the attention of the Doris Duke Foundation was because Mickey Shepard, who at the time was with the Rockefeller Foundation, put my name up. And I was like living in Miami, working at a community college, and it would have never happened had she not been at that level herself, that, you know, her counsel was being sought. And so that sort of personal responsibility to open doors is really crucial at every step of the way, And so, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought somebody said something. And I just want to, you know, really talk about the way that these legacy organizations have been sort of feeders, if you will, as to both in the artist sector, as well as in the arts leadership or administration sector. And but they can't continue to provide that function if they're constantly, you know, waking up in the middle of the night saying, how am I going to make payroll? I mean, it's a time for us to really, you know, face this systemic issue of underfunding and insufficient investment in the very organizations that are representing our communities. So one of the things that came up at the, I think it was mostly at the second panel session, and I know Melody Capote, who is now, you know, who is now the leader at the Caribbean Cultural Center, after Marta decided she was going to go island. You know, she said, why 5% payout in for the foundation sector? Why 5%? Why is that, you know, the norm? Why are we not really, you know, unpacking that that sort of paradigm of saying, if we are going to really be dealing with huge issues that have plagued our country for, you know, hundreds of years, what responsibility does philanthropy, and I want to say also government, because I think that this is a, you know, it has to be an ecosystem, right? You can't leave the artists out of the equation. You can't leave the arts administrators out of the equation. You can't leave government out of the equation, or philanthropy. So, you know, why the 5% payout? Isn't it time that we revisit that and look at, you know, kind of injections of capital into what has been a so totally undercapitalized sector of our arts community? Can you speak to that?
Well, I would just say that there are a number of conversations happening now. The issue of 5% payout is being challenged. There are leaders in the sector looking to have conversations with, policymakers and folks on the Hill to actually challenge it. And it was mentioned earlier that this year, because of the need, so many foundations actually demonstrated that they can go over and above 5%, right? And we got to try to figure out how to make those things stick. But I am happy to say, though, that there are conversations afoot, and we just need to, keep the momentum going. Whenever, and this is what happens, whenever there's been an approach to whether it's at the federal level or at the state level to further regulate, philanthropy and foundations. Foundations have a very strong lobbying base, of course. There's been backlash, particularly in places like California, when they tried to adjust payout in the past. So we have to learn from those lessons and be a little more strategic. But some of those conversations, Olga, are happening. Yes.
And I think that there's an assumption that that without addressing issues of power and racism, that if we liberated capital, that it would be going to the organizations that we care about, right? So I agree with Susan wholeheartedly. There's a history of backlash. It doesn't mean we don't do it. I think there's amazing conversations happening. At the Nathan Cummings Foundation, we use our endowment in a lot of different ways, in terms of PRIs and in terms of other ways of investment. But I do want to say that the conversation around power and the conversation that's clearly steeped in racist practices needs to be had alongside the conversation of liberating endowments, which I know is an amazing hashtag. I follow it on Twitter and on IG. But I think that without the work around, like, these are racist practices, this is redlining, as Susan's has been quoted in saying, that we shouldn't make the assumption that if we liberated the capital, that it would be going to our communities, because that's a wild assumption that we know, based on what the data tells us, is not happening right now. So I just think being strategic, but also what are the conversations, what are the preconditions that need to be put in place so that when folks like, the folks at OMGArtsplus, which are spending down, make commitments to move those dollars in the direction that we want to see those dollars moved.
That's a great point. I mean, it's not, it can't be done just willy-nilly. It really has to be a concerted action. It has to be a strong sort of philosophical movement. It has to be undergirded by facts and figures. So I'm gonna, as we start to wrap up, because I do want to leave some time for our audience to be able to interact with the panel. It's such a great panel, and I thank you all so much for making the time to participate. But it would be really great to have some real actionable recommendations coming out of the panel as to what our next steps. How do we start, it's like how do you eat a 2-ton elephant? You do it one bite at a time or whatever. I mean, is it that strategy, or is it like you just shoot the beast and start over? Like,
let me just say, I think that all of us have a responsibility. Artists have a responsibility to challenge cultural centers, to challenge museums. Museums and art cultural centers have the responsibility of challenging the system that's in place. And then, we have program officers who need to challenge their institutions that they work for. We all need to be partners in this in order to change this, in order to make this more of a movement than a chapter. Everybody's got to play their role. Wherever you're at, we all have to play our role. And that means everybody has to challenge at this time. And it's a good time to challenge. People are listening. People are looking. Nobody wants to be left behind. one foundation is going to hear, oh, wow, you know, Ford Foundation did this. Maybe we should be doing this. You know, one corporation is going to say, wow, these people gave that much. We could do better. You know, everybody has a role to play in order to make this a movement and not just a chapter.
Thank you. Marta, I see you're with us now. You wanna weigh in, maybe have a couple of questions for the panel, or?
Well, I think everybody's been talking about it, and I think we need to sort of concretize it, because Alvin used a term that I think that is key: the cultural imprint. White supremacy, and Leticia addressed it, and Margaret addressed it with white supremacy, and Susan and Bill. But I think that what we're missing is that there has been an intentionality of making sure that a Confederate imprint, in terms of the statues that have been put around, address a history and power that this country worships. I think the question of what is our cultural imprint, if we're talking about long-term and not being short-term runners, because I understand that 50 years or 60 years for some of our institutions looks like short-term compared to other institutions. But the reality remains that wealth was on our backs, right? Because we were not allowed to own land. So redlining, Susan's term is absolutely correct. Because redlining now, but historically, we were not allowed to own land, right? And that process, because this is a young country, has molded the cultural imprint. I like that term. The cultural imprint of what this United States is. If we have children in cages and families being separated, is because that imprint of supremacy is being threatened. And although we see people getting into positions, right, and all power to that, that doesn't further our imprint and our history and our legacy and what we need to do going forward in terms of the building of institutions, the training of people. Billy said something very important. We train young people to be excellent, yet we can't afford to hire them or give them health care, because our institutions are purposely and intentionally underfunded, so that we're always scrambling and not able to concentrate on putting that imprint that looks like us into the future. Although we have been part of the building of the wealth and imprinting and the ability to imprint a white supremacist framework. So that I think that we have to think, and I love the term that Rex Nettleford, Honorable Nettleford of Jamaica always said, we can't be short-term runners. We have to be long-term runners. And the idea of what the blanket that Leticia was talking about begins to develop a long-term plan that we need to be looking at as we look at the, obviously, the emergency needs of now. But we're here to stay. We're not going anywhere. And the demographics are shifting. We're already the majority. I don't accept majority minority, because I never use minority for myself and for my people. So that if we're the numerical majority, how does that translate into power, decision-making, and reparations for what has been built based on the efforts that we have put forward? And I honor the work that Margaret did at DCLA and what Gonzalo is doing, but I have yet to understand where 34 organizations get about 85% of public dollars, and the rest of the institutions, better than 1,000 institutions, get only program monies. Because in that division and in the way that that has been framed, institutions are programmed to fail. And I think that Billy, when I reached out to Billy, he was having the same issue in Chicago. So that we need to look at systemic change from a cultural blueprint, right? That represents our communities and our legacy to this nation, right? And it's a wonderful sort of gesture, right? That foundations are beginning to imprint with statues, right? With implements, with people who look like us, because it gives an image, and that's what the power of art is. It speaks without words, right? If you see an image, it's worth a thousand words, and resonates in the heart of children and in the hearts of adults. So that all that has been said is absolutely powerful. But I think that long-term blanket and that cultural blueprint that we need to develop and invest in as a community is critical, because it's not just about getting money, right? It's not just about getting money, because some of us know that some of us have a European mentality. So I don't know, I know that we have gone through supremacy and miseducation. So some of us think that our aim is to get into the boards of institutions that have oppressed us and kept us out historically. That's not and never has been my objective. My objective has always been, and I think that is the imprint of Native populations, Chicano institutions, Appalachian institutions, have been to build institutions within our communities that service the voice of our communities. And how do we implant that as a strategy moving forward that honors those traditions and those ancestors and that aesthetic vision that we bring as a people? The aim is not to get people into positions in power. I mean, in positions in traditional institutions, unless in getting those positions, it translates into furthering the objectives of our community.
So, do we have time for any questions, or?
Very well said, Martha. Dr. Martha.
Are we seeing questions?
So I haven't seen it. I don't get to see the
I think we're running over time. So
okay.
I think that what I want to say thank you to the panel, because it's so wonderful to see us reflected and us thinking of what we need to do and seeing us at all different levels of input. And I think that the time is now to see how all of where we are has input into what we want and what we dream, right? For the 7 generations going forward, like Native peoples have said. But we have to be very clear that we are implanting a cultural aesthetic, a cultural vision, and it's about shoring up our communities, making sure our communities are well, are healthy, and survive, thriving into the future. Because I've been around long enough to know, Alvin's point, there is resources out there. They're just not being made available to us. And our job is to make them available to our communities and to our children and to our children's children, because they should thrive. They should not be in scarcity. I heard the statistic the other day that more than 18 million people have slid into poverty. How is that possible?
Yeah, 8 million.
How
Yeah.
is that possible? Is it 8 million?
I think it's 8 million.
Okay,
Yeah.
8 million have slid into poverty. How is that possible in the richest country in the world? How is that possible? We cannot accept that.
No leadership.
Well, we're here. The leadership is here. So thank you for being leaders. And I'll circle back to you, leaders.
Thank you so much. I want to add my deep thanks to Marta. This has been a fabulous panel, and it's been a real just pleasure building up to it. And we have to just keep this fight up. And so I know each and every one of you is doing what he or she can in their own community, and I applaud you for that. But doing collective work is also really important. So thank you for being with us, and thank you, Marta, for putting all of these conversations together. And thank you to our audience.
Thank you for the team, Dudley, Amalia. It's been a team effort. It's not me. So I'm just here, but it's been a team effort. So thank you all.
Great. And thank you to
Wonderful
the
to
people
be
who
with
tuned
all of
in.
you.
Thank you.
This was
Bye.
beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malta.
Thank
you.
you, Marta. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you.
Susan, thank you,
you.
man.